Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters and friends. My name is Muhammad Sumbul and I'm the founder of Istanbul Youth Academy. Istanbul Youth Academy is an organization for young Muslims who want to develop themselves professionally and expand both their intellectual and spiritual knowledge. We do this through running various programs via YouTube contents, blogs, online workshops, our Academy Network program for youth, and the Mentor-Mentee program. So, and of course, we are here today for our third installment of our Muslims in Industry series. This time looking at the world of academia. We covered previously challenging and underrepresented fields such as journalism and politics. So before we begin the sessions, let's have a look at this video on what we do. Today, we'll have Dr. Yakoob Ahmed from the Faculty of Theology at Istanbul University. He will be discussing the challenges Muslims face within the academic industry and advice for aspiring academics. This session will be moderated by Razan Saffour. Razan is a communications and advocacy consultant focused on Syria. She holds a master's and a BA in history from SOAS, University of London, the same university our guest has studied at, and she is currently undertaking a second master's in civilization studies. So enough of me, I will pass it on to you now, Razan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sumbul, for that very kind introduction, and assalamu alaikum, everyone. So today, as Sumbul has already said, we will be continuing the Muslims in Industry series and focusing on academia today. So in our event today, we will be looking at the academic world, in a world where narratives, perceptions, and the dominance of ideologies are shaped by power and finance. How so is it when it concerns the world of academia? Is it an open playing field, as the name suggests, or is it introducing alternative thoughts, an uphill challenge for all those involved? We explore the obstacles, if any, what is needed to overcome them, and advice advice for aspiring academics. Today we'll be joined by Dr. Yakoob Ahmed. Dr. Yakoob Ahmed obtained his PhD from my alma mater, from the Department of Languages and Culture at SOAS, University of London. His research focuses on late Ottoman history, Muslim intellectual thought in the 19th and 20th centuries, Islamic constitutionalism, nation-state construction, the ulama history of the late Ottoman state, and identity and collective memory construction. He is currently teaching Islamic history in the Faculty of Theology at Istanbul University. So, Dr. Yakoob, if we can get started with you straight away, tell us about your journey.
Oh, wow. So it's funny because when you mentioned that to me earlier, I was thinking, okay, what am I going to say? So I'm not really good at talking about myself, although some of my friends might disagree with that. My journey is not anything exceptional. So I grew up in this regular household in South London. Parents got divorced when I was very young. They weren't what you could say, academic family. They weren't a family that were activists regarding Islam in any shape or form, simple people who didn't want me anywhere near Islamic intellectual activity or anything of that nature. But growing up, once I got to university, I became more active, as is the case in London, as you know, Razan, already. University is an interesting place in the United Kingdom where you get access to all types of people for all different denominations and thoughts. And I started to become more and more religious as a result of that. Once I did my undergrads in business computing, so it was nothing related to Islam in that shape or form. I had a standard madrasa education while growing up. And I think that was important because although people might find traditional forms of learning outdated and difficult at times, but it shaped my character in some shape or form, which high school didn't do. And then when I became more religiously active, I got a job in IT. I hated it. I did all sorts of jobs. I worked in retail, I worked in television, I worked in radio. And then I decided I wanted to study Arabic, so I went to Damascus. And I lived in Syria for a few years. And that's when things changed for me. I liked it there. I was exceptionally happy. I had no reason to come back. I was going to study Hanafi fiqh at Abu Nur. So Abu Nur was a university where they study Ulumuddin, but my mum got sick. So I came back to London. And as a result of that, I decided to do a master's in Near and Middle Eastern Studies, of which I took a module in Ottoman history, modern Islamic thought, and Turkish studies, Turkish politics. And when I completed that, I started to get a real interest in Ottoman studies. I mean, I had an interest in Ottoman studies in Syria, actually. When I was there, I was once stopped by the secret services, given a bit of hassle, and they reminded me very categorically not to talk about two subjects. One was democracy, the other one was the caliphate. And I laughed when I was spoken to in that way. And I was very immature. I was very British. I was very aggressive with them. And then I was reminded that that was a mistake. And I came back, but Ottoman history is something that stuck. And the reason why I mentioned that in regards to Syria is because the Ottoman past in Syria was often hidden by the Syrian nation state. They didn't want people to have a remnant or a positive idea of the Ottoman past. And that was quite consistent. Upon finishing my master's, I then came back to Turkey. I was working in Turkey at teaching English at Marmara University, and the friend of mine who housed me and helped me find a job passed away. So I decided to go back to Syria instead of Turkey, and I was having a great time. And I left, things kicked off in Tunisia. And when things kicked off in Tunisia, at that time, I was unaware what was going on. And I happened to just go home to visit family. And when I went home to visit family, I got a phone call from my boss in Syria, said, just hold on for a second, don't come back right now, because it might be difficult for you to catch a flight to come to Damascus. And 10 years later, I was unable to ever catch a plane to go back. So I decided to do a PhD at SOAS. I was not interested in doing a PhD. I was not interested in academia. I was still active as a Muslim. I was very active on social media. I became a foster parent for Muslim children with my family, and we were taking care of an Albanian child. So I was content with that, and that was giving back something to the community in that sense. But I then did a PhD, and then things totally changed. I got thrusted into the world of academia, where a private person like me became very public all of a sudden, and I became quite vocal with many things. And then I moved to Turkey. I was done with England. I was done with the West. It was tough for my family, and I came here, and now here I am investing in the community as much as I can. So alhamdulillah, it's been a crazy journey, but we're here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yakoob. So I want to start from, actually, I really want to start from Syria, but for the sake of this discussion, let's start from SOAS. How was it when you first started your PhD at SOAS? How was it as a Muslim PhD student at SOAS University?
Well, as you know, SOAS is unique. So in many ways, being a Muslim in SOAS was not a problem. Muslims are very active in the intellectual space. Muslims have a voice. Muslims are contributing to the discourse. And so forth. The challenge I found, though, was that SOAS was still a bubble, in the sense that I was unable to translate those ideas to any other space I went to, whether it would be another university, another talk, and so forth. So in that sense, while SOAS was interested and unique as a Muslim, and I didn't have any problems, and the Muslim body at SOAS is an eclectic one, which is something which is, once again, exceptionally unique. The challenges I started to face were more intellectual challenges. I didn't realize that when producing literature, that in academia in particular, there is a particular ideological framework which will resist what you have to say in your capacity as a Muslim. So there is a particular academic formula, there's a particular way of speaking, And as a Muslim, I started to find that very challenging. The other problem I had was that academics at SOAS were not as visible to the Muslim community, which were the student-based community. So there was a disconnect between the students and the academics. And I noticed that more and more as a PhD student. Students on the undergrad level were exceptionally active. Students on the PhD level were not so much active, and academics were just invisible to the Muslim body. So I was trying to figure out how we could try to bridge that gap. It's a tough one, because PhD students in particular have a particular focus. Their interest is not, by and large, of the activism on the ground. Their interest is finishing that PhD and then going off somewhere in industry, so that they can make a difference that way. So you always notice that. But I didn't have much of a problem at SOAS per se, but once I became part of the machinery as a PhD student, the fraternity of academia, I started to notice some of the challenges. So, yeah.
Can you tell us more about those challenges?
As I said, I mean, I can't speak in my capacity as a Muslim, which is, people will find that strange. They will say that maybe I'm over-exaggerating, but I'm not. My personal belief is that secular Western academia is intellectually violent, is exceptionally intellectually violent. I can't voice my voice in my capacity as a Muslim. I have to be academic to be accepted as an academic, which means that there is a particular intellectual tradition, that's a secular intellectual tradition, which is very Eurocentric. Even in terms of its self-criticism, it's still very Eurocentric in the way it does it. So, for example, we used to joke about how in the Journal of Islamic Studies, for example, we couldn't use the word Allah, we had to use the word God. And we always found that bizarre. It's like, it's the Journal of Islamic Studies. Everyone knows that who Allah is when we're using the word. So why did we have to use the word God? Now that might sound for many people quite minute and irrelevant, but for someone like me, it was exceptionally relevant. Because for me, I felt that that was quite intellectually violent, in the sense that as a Muslim, I was raised to say, La ilaha illallah. So it's not that Allah is the name of your Muslim God. That was his name. And okay, I can understand that when you're writing academia for a general audience, we're now going to use language and frameworks which are Eurocentric. But as a Muslim in Islamic studies, to find that was just bizarre for me. Another time was when accidentally, and I say this, like I said that, and Allah says in the Quran, and I was reprimanded for saying that. Instead, I was told that you can't say that, you have to say the Quran says. So then, me being cheeky in the way, I said, well, who wrote the book then? I mean, usually we cite the author. Who is citing? Who is citing here in terms of the author? What shall I put? This is bizarre that you want me to footnote a book without the author. And, you know, obviously the teacher was like, we don't want to get into this right now. What are you doing? But deep down, what I'm saying is that grates you, because what you're realizing is that you're in an industry, you're in a field where it's, in a very tacit way, it's still stripping you away of any agency. And you don't realize it because you become accustomed to it. You become conditioned to it. And the sort of like resistance we have regarding politics is very evident. There's a very easy, evident resistance regarding fighting for Palestine, fighting for Syria, fighting for racism, fighting for issues of gender. But these very subtle, corrosive ways in which your Muslimness and your Islam is attacked is a lot harder to navigate. And as an academic who was somebody who was going into the field of intellectual studies, I was quite concerned about that, but it was hard for me to fight that. So the machinery is huge. Initially, I tried to get support from other Muslims. They were not interested. I can understand why they're not interested. And Muslims go into academia for different reasons. So then it's trying to convince Muslims whether this is a battle worth fighting or not. And the Muslim community is quite diverse when it comes to the academic fraternity in that sense. And then I've been plastered and battered when I've gone to academic conferences around the world, where academics have taken exception to my resistance. And I've deliberately been aggressive with my resistance. And I've said this before, I feel like at the moment as Muslims, we are under immense intellectual and psychological pressure. And that psychological pressure requires equal force as a way of simply surviving. And so the intellectual and psychological violence requires a form of force that's using the same. And so that's why I do what I do, which is very strange for the field of academia, because many people feel that it's not necessary. And that's one of the reasons why then I find it hard publishing, because I'm trying to find a language in which I can publish in a way that on the one hand, we don't lose the integrity of what we feel as Muslims. And on the other hand, try to find it palatable where it can be accepted within the Western academic space. Some academics have achieved that, like Salman Saeed, Talal Asad, and so forth. They've been very unique in the way they've done that. In the field of Ottoman studies, that's a lot harder to do. We haven't got to that stage in Ottoman studies where we can do that. And so when I'm trying to do that, that's perceived as being a radical endeavor. So, but inshallah, we'll figure it out. So at the moment, what I've done is I then write for a Muslim audience in my capacity as a Muslim, and then I try to write in an academic style where I don't lose the integrity of what it means to be a Muslim, but at the same time recognize that there's a lot of what would I call gymnastics that has to be played with words and semantics, you know. So it is what it is. And then you're hoping that Muslims can read between the lines of what it is we're saying. That's the hope, that the younger generation in particular can understand what we're trying to do in between the lines, which is sometimes hard because, you know, I'm a believer that if you don't say a word, then it loses its meaning in the collective consciousness. And then no longer do people know what it means. So then I deliberately say words in public, which can get us into trouble. So it's a difficult one. And that's the challenge I've been having at the moment.
I think I certainly resonate with some of the challenges, of course, not at PhD level, but even at SOAS, like you said, SOAS, despite it being a bubble and despite it being slightly more encompassing of Muslim students, I was downgraded several times in both my BA and my master's because I chose to cite Muslim scholars. And Muslim scholars who, I meant scholars, like religious scholars, as opposed to academics. And for some reason that wasn't accepted in the academic field. And I remember very clearly like the responses that I would get from my teachers, who were great teachers, but they were also very Orientalist, and they were the students of big Orientalists. And they would tell me, this isn't academic content. You can't use this. And so you do feel like you're forced to, sometimes, to leave your Islam outside the door when you're entering the university. You spoke about your resistance and your active resistance. And I have two questions here. The first question is, do you feel like the tide is turning? Do you feel like there is a movement of Muslim academics, even if not united, that is slowly trying to kind of like claim back their agency? I mean, what you're saying resonates a lot when I think of my own academic friends who are in the UK, for instance, and how they do actively try to fight back with the language and with the topics and with the entire approach and methodology. And the other question, actually, I'll get back to that. To the other question, because it's
before I answer that question, let me posit this question back to you, because what I find interesting is, as a master's student, so what's interesting as a master's student is you're like the bridge between myself, who's a PhD student, and academia. As a master's student, what did you feel about Muslim academics and PhD students in regards to the support that you could have got in regards to those challenges you were getting? And do you think that there was a tide, in your perception? Do you think there is a change that's taking place in terms of the tide? Because in essence, my job is then to try to facilitate people like yourself.
So there's a dissonance between my experience in Turkey, which was going to be my second question, and my experience at SOAS. At SOAS, there was no support, but I think that was because the university was much bigger. And like you said, like there's a complete dissonance between the undergrads and then the PhD and then the actual academics. Like I was very active in my undergrad, but we never really thought to even go to Professor Abdul Halim, for instance, who's a Muslim academic in our own university. When I became a master's student, I was much more in touch with the PhD students at the time. I remember you were there. I didn't get to meet you, but I was definitely in touch with people like Wala, etc. But there was no consciousness really to kind of like go and seek help. I think we just assumed that this was part and parcel of academia. And only now, at least for me, only now am I becoming much more aware that actually I could have pushed back. Now that I'm in Turkey, I feel like the pushback is much more pronounced.
I can hear that. I mean, in terms of SOAS, you're right. It's a strange place. I mean, the culture doesn't facilitate that sort of like that sort of Muslim activity in that sense. But what I can say, since graduating, this is my personal experience, and I'm still aloof. I'm still very private as a person, so I don't activate in the Muslim academic space as much. But I can say, just like there's a Muslim Twitter, there's a Muslim academia, and this is interesting. There are academics who are listening and who are straddling the line of activism and being academics and producing knowledge and trying to find a way of trying to place their academic work in a space in which Muslims can take benefit from in their capacity as Muslims. It is happening now. I think they're far more active than I am on social media. So in that sense, it's interesting that's taking place. Whether it's trickling down, you would know that better than me. So that's just why I was asking you the question, because it's interesting to hear your experiences regarding Turkey and the UK.
I certainly feel like Muslim academics now, particularly those that I know in the UK and even here and across the world, they have to wear many hats, and it does get very tiring at times because they will face consequences. Yeah. If they're a professor or an assistant professor or an associate, or even just a PhD student at, say, Edinburgh University, it's very difficult for them to speak about certain things, but naturally the topic of their study, because particularly those who like their topic of the study is Muslims, and it's concerning Muslims in contemporary politics. How do you then separate between your activism, your identity as a Muslim, and then your actual research? And it's very interesting sort of like noticing that shift, and it's interesting because I have many friends and you see the burnout, and you also see how they have to literally tread on eggshells, which brings me to the question of you coming to Turkey. So you said that you were tired of England. You were tired of England because of like the subtle instances of Islamophobia and racism.
You know what? There's lots of layers to this. I didn't personally. So the burnout you talk about, I've seen it, and that's because a lot of Muslims are not only straddling the line of trying to survive within the academic world, which is minefields in of itself, and then there's the pressure from the machinery, but also for Muslims. Actually, there's an expectation from Muslims and young Muslims that their academics ought to be a particular way, and so they're straddling two pressure points. One is an internal audience, and one is the audience of their workplace, and that's where the exhaustion comes in. And then the inter-Muslim contestations that take place, which leave them exceptionally burned out in that sense. And then they're on social media, which is, humongous emotional like pressure cooker. So it's hard for me. I don't belong to any of those spaces. I was very aware of all of that, seeing that from my colleagues, and decided I'm not interested in that. What my interest was initially, because like I said, I lived in Syria and so forth, fundamentally is how could I take what I'd learned in the UK, give it to Muslims, and where could I give it to Muslims? Now in the United Kingdom, my students would be 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe in a class, whereas in Turkey, all my students are Muslims. So that was the same in Syria in that sense. Well, not all the students were Muslims in Syria, like in Turkey, but by and large, that was the case, right? There was pressure, as you mentioned, regarding Islamophobia in the United Kingdom. I could have navigated that. I mean, we get used to it. I think it's exhausting, but it could have happened. There were many Muslim university schools and so forth who were willing to pay someone like me to stay in the UK. I just found everything exhausting, though. I just found the 9 to 5 exhausting. I found the lack of Islam in the everyday space exhausting. I got tired of looking at the back of packets to see if something is halal or not. It's just everything just got to a point where I thought, I'm done with this. And so when I came to Turkey, actually, in fairness, I didn't only come to Turkey to take as a Muslim. I came to Turkey to give, because I actually learned that in Syria. When I was in Syria, I remember speaking to a young student who was studying Ulumuddin, and he says, no, the problem with Western Muslims, they come to Syria, they learn, and they go back home, and they give us very little in return. And that stuck in my head for a very long time. So then I decided that when I would come to the Muslim world, that I would be committed to the place that I'm in, and give everything I could to the local community, whatever that community comprised of, and not abandon that. And so I have then come here with the intention of giving everything I can to the community, which can be far more exhausting than being in the UK at times. But when you conceptualize it, that you're doing this for the sake of Allah, you can then get through it. Whereas in the UK, at times I just felt very disconnected from what it was that I was doing, and I was being dragged in all different directions intellectually. So yeah, so it's a different experience in that sense. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. In the UK, did you ever feel the pressure of representing an entire Muslim community, given your background, given you being an academic, whether from Muslims themselves or from the non-Muslim communities?
No, because you know what? I didn't stick around long enough. I left England. I've been on the road for 17 years, on and off, traveling to Muslim countries. But when I was doing my PhD, and more recently now, I do often hear Muslims from the UK making the case that I've abandoned them. And they will make the case that, you know, you're born and raised in England, that the community needs you, we need you to be more visible, why did you leave, what's going on here? And when I was in the UK, there was an expectation that I should be doing more to be more visible for Muslims. And that was hard because I'm a private person. So my students know this, which is like, because I'm a private person I'm trying to withdraw myself. That's why I came off social media and so forth. It then becomes very difficult because in terms of the Muslim community, we have very few spaces of power in which people can represent the interests of the community. The people affiliated to Ulum ad-Din, whether the imams, ulama, and so forth, is one space. Then there's academia, which is another space. Then there's journalism, which is another space, and there's politics. And in England, in regards to both men and women, and in regards to Muslims of different ethnicities and denominations, there seems to be a conflation in regards to representation. So this is the problem we're having in that sense. And then even internally, we have our conflicts in regards to race, gender, class. We are part of that struggle in of ourselves, because we're reflective of the society we live in. So we're no different in that sense to what's happening in the mainstream society. So that is part of the challenge. So coming here, I try to break those as much as I can and try to be as immersive as I can and listen to my students as much as I can. So I actually give my students as much time as I can, because one of the things I learned at SOAS, as you mentioned, was that the Western academic very rarely listened to their students, very rarely gave time to this. Now I'm a Muslim. So one of the things I noticed at SOAS, because I did listen to people at SOAS, even though I wasn't there much, whenever I came in, which was young students would say, we couldn't see people like yourself. People like yourself were never available for us. We couldn't get access to you. Now you mentioned people at Wala and so forth. She was a lot better in that sense of probably giving access to people like yourself. So I've taken from that. And then when I've come to Turkey, I've made sure that I can give as much access to people as I can within reason.
Okay, so we've spoken about some of the challenges, and I think before opening up the floor, I actually want to ask you about the perks of being a Muslim in academia.
I don't know how to answer that question. I haven't seen any perks for myself personally, but I know why Muslims would do it. It's prestigious. You're in a position of power and authority. People listen to your voice. You are one is somebody in the community where the community turns to you. They listen to you. And you reflect a particular power group. And you have access to resources, which is usually knowledge. You have access to people of power. You have the capacity to travel, and we're privileged. We are privileged in that our job is to read and write, and we get paid to think. That's what we get paid to. And I say this because, you know, when I was doing this, my mother was frustrated because she wanted me to do STEM, and she said, "Who's going to pay you to think?" You know, for her, it's a very simple thing, but I always say it's actually quite profound. Who's going to pay you to think? And yet here I am in an institution, shall I say, a meta institution where I do get paid to think. But that comes with its pitfalls. Now, I'm not personally, I don't really care about the perks of academia, but I can see why a Muslim would want to study academia, because it can look great when you're looking up. And Muslim academics have a way of projecting that as well. So I can understand it.
And don't you also think, like, obviously we need to regain our narratives, particularly when it comes to history, Oriental studies?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I agree with that. I agree. And I think that's why we do need more.
Yeah, absolutely.
No doubt.
So, oh, and lastly, the last question, which I'm sure people will ask, and it will come up several times. Do you have any advice right now from the top of your head that you would give generically to Muslims wanting to pursue academia?
So
allow me to this. When I say Muslims wanting to pursue academia or like higher academia, I don't mean to pursue Muslim-based topics, or Islam being their main priority or what's driving them, but naturally as Muslims in academia, particularly Muslims in the West and in this very sort of like competitive field, we will naturally all face certain challenges. So what advice would you give?
See, the challenge for me is that I think the academic model is changing. And I would tell young Muslims to just look at where the curve is at the moment in terms of, are we really, is academia, so the idea in the West is you go into academia to get a job so that you can go into, and you can go into a particular industry. That was not the objective of academia initially. And so one of the problems with the academic model is the undergrad student is actually being trained to go up the pyramid to become master's, PhD, and then an academic, if you actually look at the way academia functions. And so it's kind of weird because on the one hand, it's telling you that you're going to get skills in the university circuit so that you can go out to the job market. But in actuality, the way it's constructed in regards to culture is actually trying to train you to be an academic in that sense. So it's trying to feed itself in regards to the structure that it is. For me, academia is one form of, or one institution in which knowledge learning takes place. It's the most dominant framework that we have right now in regards to learning so that Muslims can go into the various professions. But I personally feel if Muslims don't want to go into academia, that's okay. I'm now trying to encourage Muslims to maybe, in our capacity as Muslims, try to start thinking. I mean, maybe young people right now, it's hard for them because for the now, people would need to go into academia. But I think that we need to start thinking of alternative models to the academic model. I think the internet is changing that. I think there's a lot of decentralization of knowledge. There's what we call the democratization of knowledge. I think Muslims more and more are feeling that the amount of time they commit to academia is to the detriment of them learning their Islam. And Islam is equally important in regards to learning. So we need to find some sort of middle house here. So yeah, if Muslims want to go into academia because they want to become professionals, we need many, no doubt, in every field. And I get asked all the time when I study Ottoman history that your background's from Pakistan. Why did you do Ottoman history? It's a silly question. Like, just study everything. So in that sense, I don't have a problem with Muslims studying whatever they want to study, whatever field they're in. And I'm not against STEM subjects. What I'm saying is that we have an intellectual deficit. Academia, to some degree, provides a particular space regarding knowledge and a particular worldview regarding intellectualism, but it's not the only space. And I think we need to now become a lot more diverse and a lot more creative in some ways. So for people like me and yourself who are going into academia, it's like, okay, what can we take from that? But now what can we do creative with that? Or do we want to be stuck in the everyday grind of what academia is? And it is a grind, it grinds you down. And it takes the best years away from you, and it takes the most creative aspect away from you. You and I have accepted the fact that as Muslims, in our capacity of Muslims, whether it's on the intellectual plane or whether on the everyday plane, it's really hard to express yourself. And if that's the machinery you're in from day to day, then that will weigh you down, and you will become submissive and compliant to the framework that you're involved in. So as a result, Muslims, I think, now need to get creative. That knowledge production shouldn't simply be vested in the academic space. especially for us as Muslims who want an alternative for the world that we're living in. But we do need more journalists. We need more intellectuals. We need more academics who will teach. We need more imams who are aware of the everyday language that's changing in the world that we live in right now, of which academia is a part of. Academia is far more, or academics are far better integrated within the social media culture, which is a particular form of knowledge and power, than people are of ulum ad-din. And so as a result of that, we have to find a way of trying to bring these various different, what can I call it, like places of knowledge together. So as Muslims, we have that capacity. We can do that. So I think we have to now start having a conversation. Those of us who are already, so like yourself, who's doing a second master's, like myself, who's a PhD graduate, and for many of the students who are now going to graduate from their undergrads into masters and PhD, we said once you graduate, how can we create a different space, an alternative space where we can combine both the tradition, what we've learned in academia, and the new technology that's coming around to try to give Muslims the edge in that sense. And I think that's necessary to start discussing. So yeah, that's my main thought process. But the everyday challenges in academia within the classroom environment, I think Muslims need to be more supportive of each other in that sense, because it's a difficult place being a Muslim. I mean, I'll give you an example. There is an assumption, the statistics are showing that the more people who go to university, I mean, the more people who are leaving Islam, or the more people who are becoming irreligious, are people who are trained within the university circuit. So that means students go to university, they study, and then they decide religion's not for me, irrespective of what the religion is, which then seems to indicate on a very shallow level that religion is backwards, because once you go to university, you learn the truth. You learn what the truth is from a particular knowledge base, and you realize that religion is a waste of time. What we're actually realizing is no, because both you and I have just mentioned that academia is suppressive of religion, especially of Islam, that those who are coming out of academia never were given a fair chance to express their Islam in the first place. And so they were indoctrinated with a particular form of knowledge base to the detriment of Islam, which has its own knowledge base, because Islam never had a fair chance in the first place. And imagine that that's happening to you from the age of 11 all the way up until the age of 25, 26, 27. That's a humongous part of your youth given to a particular form of knowledge. And that's why people are leaving Islam. So people are not leaving Islam because Islam is backwards and that they're becoming more enlightened by going to university. People are probably abandoning parts and aspects of Islam, both in their physical appearance and in their intellectual and private spaces, simply because the whole academic experience, which is interconnected with the culture, music, popular culture, social media, and so forth, it doesn't give Islam a fair hearing. So Islam is being pounded all the time. And so you can't express yourself in your capacity as a Muslim. So the question is, can we fight that when we're in the academic space? Should we fight that? What should we do as Muslims? Because it's like holding a boulder coming down a hill, and that's tough. And so that's something we might need to consider as well. So those of us who are going into academia, we need to be safeguarded. We need Muslims in academia to be brave. We need Muslims in academia to challenge the academic discourse that they put out regarding not only Islam, but everything else. We need Muslims to protect each other within the academic space. We need Muslims to work together within academia. And at the same time, we need to also try to create alternative spaces, alternative modes of knowledge, and be creative. So it requires that. And what it then requires is that Muslims get polemical when they start thinking and start talking. And that requires real engagement, intellectual engagement. So that's necessary. And I think that's where Muslims unfortunately become occupied, because life is life. People want to get married, they want to have children, they need work, and that takes over. And the idealism that you have when you're young, when you get to my age, it starts to phase out.
Thank you, Dr. Yakoob. Certainly working and cultivating a much more holistic and congruent space is very important. I think we will open up the floor for questions. If you would like to either ask a question, you can raise your hand and then we'll take it one by one, or you can send in and I'll read them out. I think we have the first question coming in from Omar. Omar, the floor is yours.
Omar, your mic is off.
Yeah, Omar, if you'd like to unmute. Omar al-Bakri. Okay, in that case.
Oh, no, Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question since I saw your, it was written about late Ottoman history or into that. You know how the West has, for example, different views about the Ottomans, and some people, let's say, specifically Sultan Abdul Hamid II, which he had a lot of propaganda on him, such as blood Sultan and things like this. I want to ask, let's say when you are writing a paper or someone else is writing a paper, how do they judge that paper? Do they judge it according to what is the right history? What is their view of history? How do they see that? Because this is confusing for me to understand. What do they see? What is right? What is wrong? From history wise, because you know how the winner usually writes history. Let's say, do you get what I mean?
I totally get what you're saying. So in fairness, the academic space is quite robust to the point that it can be challenged. It's not that it can't be challenged, it can be challenged. The issue is that we're expected to challenge it, however, within the framework which is being created. So if we want to deconstruct or dispel the myths regarding Sultan Abdul Hamid, for example, then you would have to find evidence and construct your argument in a way that is conclusive enough to make your case. One of the things I've learned as a Muslim is if you're going to, as a Muslim, be firing bullets at Western academics, you need to make sure that your base is covered, which means you're going to be scrutinized twice as much. And because you're going to be scrutinized twice as much, it means your argument has to be twice as tight. And so the academic machinery does allow alternative voices and spaces to exist. It's just that you need to be able to articulate it in a way which has the empirical evidence that backs your claim, and it is presented in a way in which it can be palatable for even those people that dislike you. Now, you're always going to get people who don't like you in that sense. I mean, and this is what I mean in academia. I have had academics critiquing what I say. And so what I try to do is then use the sources from the Ottoman archives and try to be as, and then deconstruct the arguments that they put forward. In many ways, all of us as historians, we accept this in the field of history, that nobody is the real carrier of the truth. That it is subjective. There's no denying that. And that the key is how do you present your argument in a way where at least it can be tolerated. Now, when we see in the mainstream media, for example, there's heavy Islamophobia. Academia is a lot more sophisticated than that. So whereas in the media, you could just show an alternative and you have to keep blasting away until you can try to shame the hypocrisy. In academia, it's a lot harder to do that. So you really have to make your case as if you're a lawyer, and making the point. Now, what's happened with Muslims is Muslims, by and large, we haven't done that enough in that sense. And so this is something that we need to work on as a way. And in that sense, academia has been helpful for me. It's helped me in a way of being able to construct my argument in a way where I'm forced to make sure that my argument is as watertight as possible, because I know the aggression will be twice as much. And so this is what we're forced to do. We're forced to then make sure that when we make a claim, that the claim is heavily substantiated. And so it's evidence after evidence after evidence, trying to make sure that the claim is tight. And if we're deconstructing a claim, then we have to show how the evidences that they use. I give you an example. Recently, a scholar in the United States of America was talking about how the Ottomans were backwards in regards to the printing press. And yet this narrative has come from the Orientalists. And what's interesting is the quote that's been cited from the Orientalists is from an opinion from one Frenchman who made this case regarding the Ottomans. So how do you deconstruct this? The one way you deconstruct this is you start saying, what are the opinions of the Ottomans themselves? What did the Ottomans write? And then what you try to do is you try to deconstruct that one French guy by saying, okay, who is this French guy? We would then realize that he was an Orientalist. We then deconstruct all the books that use these footnotes by showing consistently that every other academic has been lazy and sloppy in this claim. And then what you try to do is you then try to show that ideologically there is a particular disposition in looking at the Ottoman past in this way. Muslims don't do that. They don't put in this type of effort. They just would say, I read in a book, I read in a history book, I read on the internet. And so what we need then is to do that. Now, Afzal has just made a point about how important is Muslim publishing. I think it's very important. I think Muslims should write in the Western academic space because there is a robustness in the Western academic space that there's a lot that we can still take from in terms of learning, in terms of how sophisticated it is. But I think we also need to create an alternative space which is independent in many ways, that can support Muslim circulation of knowledge for Muslims. Razan made a really valid point when she said she was using members of the ulama in her work and it was being rejected because they're not perceived as being academics. And yet, if you're writing about Islam, the ulama are authorities on Islam, and so they're part of that framework, their voice needs to be heard. Why are they being rejected in that sense? And so they are source material. So she's citing source material directly, and they're being rejected. The source material has been rejected. I give an example. One time, I wrote an article, and it was about a white author who was talking about Muslim experiences in Britain, and I challenged that. And the woman goes, well, you've cited no one. I said, I'm the evidence. My experience is the evidence. I speak to people every day. Now, I learned that in academia, they're not going to take that. So then what did I do? I started interviewing Muslims. I interviewed 50, 60 Muslims, and then I used that as evidence to say that I did some data collecting as a result of that. And there's all different ways that we can find. So we have to be creative in that sense. But this is the challenge. And so Muslims need to be robust. They need to be robust in understanding what the argument is on the other side. They need to be well trained, and they need to really be careful, because we're under a lot of scrutiny when we put our opinions out there.
Dr. Yakoob, just on that note, can you speak more about the expectation of objectivity? I know that many people speak about it being a myth, particularly in any industry, not just in academia, but since we're on this topic, can you speak more to it?
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion, and this is my personal opinion, I just don't think there's a such thing as objectivity in academia. The reality is that you have to present yourself, you have to project objectivity. The idea that it's objective is a lie. And in that sense, what you're trying to do is you're trying to project objectivity in a way of suggesting, okay, look, this is what you require that shows the truth. So then I'm going to do this to make my case that this is the truth. Now you can't critique me because I've done what you've asked me to do. Why are you now rejecting what I'm saying? So in that sense, that's part of the challenge. So we're working a lot harder in that sense, because you realize that one's opinion is only as tight as the amount of information they have. So what's expected from you is to attain as much information as possible. The more information you have, the tighter your opinion can be, because the more you have to work with. So this is what we need to work on, trying to attain as much information as possible. And then not only that, where's the information coming from? What are the sources of that information, and so forth. And I've noticed in Western academia, even though it's presented as being objective, it's not objective. It can't be objective. How can it be objective when judging Islam in particular? When you strip away the many aspects and components of Islam, you strip away Allah, you strip away Allah from the Quran, you strip away many of the authorities and voices from the Quran. I've been specifically told once, two Israeli academics tried to shut me down by teaching me what Islam was, and saying such and such academic says. I said, I don't care what the academic says. You know, in the end of the day, I can show you a host of works of what Muslims say. I'm going to source material. And it's interesting because if I put the argument regarding LGBT or race, if I said to them, if I'm a black man, you don't tell a black man what it means to be black. Or if I'm part of the LGBT community, you don't tell me what it means to be that. How is it acceptable that, but you can tell me what it means to be Muslim? You can tell me what Islam is. How is that even acceptable? But it works, because that's just the way it is, because Islam can be objectively, studied in that way. So, and as a Muslim, then we have to find a different way of putting the arguments forward. I'm not convinced personally that it's objective. I don't think Western academia can ever be objective regarding Islam. It is framed within a particular subjectivity. Nonetheless, there is a perception that it perceives and projects in regards to objectivity. So let's just accept that and move on. I think there is an element of truth that can be found in that style of writing. But in regards to Muslims and Islam, we should be aware of that. And so we should, that's why I'm saying, sometimes read between the lines of what some Muslims are trying to say, because sometimes they can't openly say it in that sense. So this is where the challenge is, I guess. And I think it's work in progress, Razan. I think it's hard. It's not easy. But you come across as a conspiracy. One comes across as a conspiracy theorist. Do you know what I mean? Like you're crazy. Like, so you say, but I mean, when I'm in the academic field, I just shrug my shoulders or whatever.
Okay. So we have a question scroll down. We have a question from Nada. Nada says, it was mentioned earlier that the use of particular words to refer to religious concepts such as God, etc., was something that Western academics often stand against. How can we tackle the jargon issue and the sensitivity against the use of Islamic terminology? I think you just touched upon that now, but if you can expand briefly.
Yeah, so I've said there's probably 3 ways. One of the ways is, regarding Islam, translation is a humongous problem. I've said this before in other talks and people have got offended. I've made the argument that Islamicate languages submitted to Islam wholeheartedly. What I mean by that is that Arabic submitted to Quran, and so Arabic became Islamized because of Quran. And so a lot of jargon within the Arabic language, it's dependent on the culture of Islam itself. Even non-Muslim Arabs, when you speak to them, to some degree, you start to see that they're embracing or they're understanding Islam. And even non-Muslim Arabs are part of the Islamicate culture in many ways in the Arab world, because they've been so heavily influenced by the language, culture, tradition, and history of Islam. Then what I say is we have Islamicate languages. These are other languages. It can be Urdu, Bangla, Albanian, Turkish, Persian, Yoruba, Malay, Jawi, whatever you want to call it. And these languages, they submitted to Islam in the sense that at one point they had a script which was Islamic, an Arabic script which lent to the particular culture. And 2, they either borrowed words from the Islamic worldview, or they translated words which became synonymous with the Islamic worldview. So for example, namaz. Namaz, when you see in Turkish or Urdu or Farsi, it's synonymous with salah. We know exactly what it means. So a lot of these Islamicate languages, they became what you could call integrated within the Islamic worldview. And so I say that they also submitted to Islam. Now, English, German, French, what they call modern languages, these modern languages have never submitted to Islam in that way. They've actually submitted to a particular secular worldview about life, which means the words that they use are conducive to secularism. They promote a particular secular thinking that's ingrained in the language in of itself, and their roots stem back from a Judeo-Christian tradition of which they can facilitate for that. So as Muslims, we're kind of having a difficult game here. Either we translate words, okay, but then words get lost in, meaning gets lost in translation, right? So salah, you call it prayer, you've lost the meaning. So here we have a problem in that sense. Or you try to retain the integrity of the words that exist in the particular language you're using. So you could just use the word salah. You can use the word, for anything else, like Allah. You retain them by doing that. But by doing that, you might face certain challenges, but you'd have to be brave. And I think a lot of Muslims should start using, when they're talking in English in particular, because English is such a large, because so much work on Islam now has been produced in English, especially academia and journalism, and even on social media. I think we should start trying to incorporate words for now in their original language and just use it in the English text without translation. Because when you're translating, you're doing one of 2 things. You either literally translate, so meaning is lost, or you derive meaning when you translate, which is an ideological endeavor, because you have to explain and put a thought process into why you translated it in the way you did. That's always challenging. So then what I encourage is that Muslims must then also learn an alternative Islamic language so that they can express themselves in that language, in that sense. And I'll give you a funny example. While I speak in English, I'm born and raised in English and so forth. When I'm praying to Allah, when I'm speaking to Allah, I still speak in my mum's mother tongue. It just feels far more Islamic to me in that sense. And, I was joking with my students the other day that even when I listen to nasheeds, I was teaching my students one of the nasheeds of Iqbal, and it just sounds far more powerful and pertinent and to the point in Urdu than it does in English. It just does, and that's one of the things. So the problem with translation is there are some words they translate and they mistranslate them, and there's some words they don't translate and they leave them messy and dirty, like khilafah, like jihad, and and like even the words kufr. Like my students get nervous when you mention the word kufr, like not in Turkey but in the West, because these words are framed in this particular way, and yet it's important to use the words in the way that they're used in the Islamic culture, because if you don't understand it from its root meaning, it loses its meaning, and then you don't know what it means. And then what you're doing is you're playing catch up because you're playing the game of the translator. Okay, does this mean such and such? And that's not what it meant though. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Either we retain the words in its original form and we use it in the English text in that form, and we footnote it, or we translate it, but we translate it in a way which is indigenous to us, which might be a lengthy process, but at least we're in control of that translation, and we don't outsource the translation to someone else, and so forth. So I think these are some of the ways that we can do that. But fundamentally, I still believe that we should also be learning and engaging in Islamic languages. That's necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Yakoob. I think there's also the challenge of the appropriation. So as we see, our language also gets appropriated, like concepts like jihad, or mass appropriation, concepts like Islamism, which actually is a very Orientalist concept, but we, particularly in the Arab world, they've sort of adopted it, and people assume that it actually comes from Arabic when it doesn't necessarily come from Arabic. And so also how to navigate with the entire concept of appropriation itself. Yeah,
I agree. I totally agree. I mean, so when you look in the Arabic language, we don't have a word for Islamism. We don't have a word for secularism. It came later because we had to define it, because in the Islamic world, to some degree, there wasn't a need to create this sharp distinction between the Islamic and the secular, in the sense that, Islam was all encompassing. It was a worldview. So anything in between, people just understood it. They just understood this is part of Islam. Whereas now we have to define it. Is it Islamic or is it secular? Which one is it? And there is no ground for this middle ground in that sense. In Islam, the Islamic lifestyle is far more organic in that sense. So as khilafah, jihad, forget these words. There's so many words. The list goes on, Allah, God is not the correct translation of Allah. Ask any Arab. If you say La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, they will tell you that sounds bizarre to their ears. It just sounds odd, because that's not what it means. The word ilah and Allah, they have two different meanings. There is no, ilah here means there is not any form of superiority. It's not greater than Allah, because that's the name of the God, Allah. His name is Allah. And we use that specifically. And so Rasulullah came to tell you that the name of the God that all of you worship is Allah. But you can't say that. So you have to use the word God, which then somehow it loses its value for me, which sounds extreme from my perspective. You might think, it's not that heavy. It's not that, why is he going crazy? But it is. It's important to me, because like if I was to have children, I want to tell them that his name is Allah. Like, understand, you're ingrained in the culture, because this is what I mean by this, like this form of violence. It gradually just keeps stripping away from you the way that you spiritually connect with with Islam. In that sense, everything is taken away from you, and you're understanding them within a different cultural language, which, as Razan said, a form of appropriation, or it's stripped away from any agency, and it loses its meaning. So I think we need to be a bit more steadfast in trying to maintain that, because there's a humongous cultural onslaught at the moment in regards to our language, our languages, our culture, our history, our tradition. And as I said, if you can't say the word, if the word is no longer, you're not able to say it anymore, it then leaves the collective consciousness. When it leaves the collective consciousness, when the new generation who are unaware of this word, when they see it in the tradition, they either will misunderstand it or they will reject it outright. And then they would embrace the sort of terms that are given to them by the alternative worldview. So that's my concern. That's what I can say.
Thank you, Dr. Yakoob. I'm going to move on to the questions that are in the chat, but I do want to tell people that please don't be shy. Please do unmute and say your question. We'll start with Salman, and if anyone else who's written the question wants to read it out themselves, that would be great. Salman's question is, how can Muslim academics play a role in politics, especially most of the universities in the Muslim world is a form of colonial legacy where academics are so disengaged from politics?
I don't think academics are disengaged in politics. I think academics reflect a particular type of politics. I don't, just like the ulama, I remember when I listened to Hamza Yusuf. Hamza Yusuf is not apolitical. Apolitical is still a political position. It's just a particular form of politics. So in that sense, I think the demands from academics and Muslim academics, from Muslims, should not be any different than the demands of Muslims in any position of authority and power. Academics, their job in the West anyway, is supposed to be to try to provide or to cultivate a particular discourse, culture, understanding. They talk to politicians all the time. They create a particular language for politics, for journalism, and for culture. We're involved in that process. And so I think Muslims should continuously demand better from their academics, especially Muslim academics. And then Muslim academics should be aligned in trying to protect the tradition, in the sense they should be working with the ulama. They should be working with people in their communities. They should be listening to their communities in terms of what their problems are. They should be listening to their students and asking them, okay, what's going on? And we have to be better connected in that sense. So in many ways, it does feel like, and people have said this before, that academics, especially Muslim academics, it sounds like that they're sitting in an ivory tower and they're looking down on everyone else. If that's the case, then call it out. We should be more engaged and involved. But this is a collective experience. Well, my personal belief, the older I've got, is that I've been fortunate enough to engage with people who are older than me and engage with people who are younger than me. And that's necessary. If you're only engaging with people from your own age group and your own age group only, what happens is you become disconnected from the breadth of society, which is there are many people of an older generation who have much to contribute and give. It creates a sense of humility interacting with people who are older than you, who are more experienced than you in that sense. And at the same time, you're connected with the younger generation who are raising and growing and who have a lot of good ideas and thoughts to say. And so you have to be connected to both. And I think this is necessary. I feel sometimes there are generational disconnects, and this is not helpful, especially for many of the young Muslims who are from abroad who are living in Istanbul. At times, they have no one but their own peers and age group who they can mix with. And I think it's important. It was important for me to have people who are older than me, who gave me a sense of balance in my life, because that's what it means naturally to live in any given society. So I think we should be better connected in some ways. But I have no problem with younger people. My students will tell you this. They can call me out in the classroom and we will engage with it. And I think that's necessary. So demand it from them.
I think that's definitely important. And I think if we go back to what we were speaking about earlier, my own experience in Istanbul and studying now with the Alliance of Civilizations has been so different from SOAS. Like now I actually have a support network and we can openly challenge our teachers in class, even though obviously the pandemic is here and everything's on Zoom, but it's a much more sort of relaxed atmosphere. I do feel like there is a conversation happening, and sometimes I would raise something in class and my teacher would come back to the next class and she'd have a different answer. Whereas sometimes, like you said, in the West, it is much more rigid. Granted, not all the times. I mean, again, like there are always, like, you know, good teachers here and there, good professors here and there, but in general, it's much more rigid. The next question is from Humaira. I think I'll read it out if Humaira isn't going to. Humaira says, I remember that the Islamic discourse was forbidden in the Turkish Republic, especially between 1925 and 1950 in journals. Muslims then used a metaphoric language to express themselves, hoping that other Muslims would understand them. For example, Buyukdu, which means the Great East, as a journal name, meaning the Ummah. Could Could their way be an example for us to slowly create an Islamic discourse in academia?
Yeah, and I think we're at a stage right now where we can be a lot more vocal. I was given a talk a few days ago on Palestine, and I started off by saying to the organizers, don't be afraid. So I got there was a concern that we might get shut down and so forth. And so I had to make it clear that we're Muslim, don't be afraid. And when I teach my students about when Sayyidina Abu Bakr is in the cave of Rasulullah, Rasulullah says, don't be afraid. Abu Bakr has a right to be afraid. Of course he's afraid. It's human to be afraid. I'm not saying don't be afraid, but when you're afraid, it's important that within your community, you have people who remind you not to be afraid, that Allah Ta'ala is sufficient. And in that sense, in terms of the intellectual endeavor, there was a moment where, at moments in history, it was hard for Muslims to say openly what they wanted to say. And so it required a form of creativity. If we are in those positions, if we are in those frameworks where we are unable to speak about particular things because we feel like that will be to the detriment of the individual or to the community, then get creative. But if it's possible to speak the truth and you can say it in maintaining the integrity of the idea in the language that it's in, then say it. And we're at a moment right now, I believe this, that I think Muslims should take a few more intellectual risks in terms of speaking truth as a way of seeing what it is that they can maintain and what they can do and what they can't. There's only one way of finding out. You have to kind of like lob the grenade into the environment and see what comes out from it. I think we should do both, but I think we require now Muslims to be a lot more braver. Like, let's look at the Palestinian issue right now. Muslims need to be more vocal and just call a spade a spade. When we look at the Syrian issue, Muslims need to call a spade, or when the Uyghur issue. Now, do I expect people who are Uyghur to be as vocal? No, I don't have that expectation from them. It's not fair to have that expectation from them. They're going through a very difficult situation. So from them, if they start to use clever language, then we have to be smart enough to understand that language because of the framework they're in. But for those of us who have a freedom in a different part of the world, then we have to be a lot more vocal in that context. And there are different pressures in different areas. Like in the West, as Razan and I both know, there's a different type of pressure in the way that you articulate yourself. And then there's a different type of pressure in Turkey, and there's a different type of pressure in different areas. So once again, what I'm saying is read the room in terms of what the environment is, see what you can do, what you can get away with. We need truth speakers. So unfortunately, those truth speakers will have to, take it on the chin and go for it. And we need intellectual output. I've said this before, and this is going to sound really harsh, but at the moment we've become consumers of knowledge. We're not being producers of knowledge, and we have to start producing knowledge. Really put it out there. We need to write books, pamphlets, articles. Twitter it can only give you so much. Its longevity, I don't know how long it will be. But writing, serious writing, is timeless in that sense. And the Quran is the reflection of that. It's sufficient to know Quran just by memorizing. We don't actually need the physical book. We can have enough people who could just, Allah Ta'ala could have made it in a way where everyone just memorized it all the time, but still it became a book. And it was known, it's called Al-Kitab. So everyone knew it was going to be a book before it was even completed in that sense. So I think there is some benefit, the second verse, the second surah in the Quran revealed Rasulullah is Al-Qalam. Like there's some benefit in producing knowledge, which is part of our pedagogy, which is part of our Islamic culture. So I encourage that we produce as much knowledge as possible by writing. And that's a hard endeavor because it requires thinking, it requires being criticized, it requires backwards and forwards, it takes time, it's exhausting, but we need to do that. So we need to do that, I think. That's my opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yakoob. We have a question here from Ibrahim.
Mm-hmm.
Ibrahim has asked, the academic world has been occupied by the Westerners. The Muslims in the academic world are not really given fair chance. For instance, 1,000 Westerners' work would be checked before considering one Muslim work, except if the Muslims work from the Westerners' point of view. How do you think we can fight this? I think this has been spoken about briefly, but if you'd like to.
You know what, to be honest with you, Muslims are scrutinizing every aspect of life in the West. No matter what they do, whatever they do, they have to, look, I give an example. I was stopped, a few years ago, I was stopped at the airport by the police, secret services in England, because I had a one-way ticket to Turkey. And I tried to explain to them that I live in Turkey, which they didn't want to accept that explanation. They thought I was going to go over the border to fight. And I had to show them that I'm an academic, I work at this university. Luckily for me at the time, I was given a presentation at a place where Tayyip Erdogan had signed the bottom. It was an invitation by the presidency. And so I pulled out his letter. And I was very difficult with this police officer. And he said to me, Mr. Ahmed, and then I had to say Dr. Ahmed, because this is what you have to do in the West to try to get your sort of sense of acceptance. And he went, Dr. Ahmed, are you not proud to be British? And I laughed and said, that's a racist question. And he goes, how's it racist? I said, because you're not asking if I'm proud. You're asking if I'm grateful. You would never ask a white person that question. Now, this is the thing that we go through every single day in the West. And so as a result of that pressure, many Muslims in the West either want to comply to that identity, that worldview, that framework, and they're trying to be accepted and tolerated, and they work really hard with that. The problem is that over a prolonged period of time, gradually Muslim identity is being eroded away to the point that the power, which is the government, popular culture, the media, and so forth, is grinding the Muslim down to the point that in the next 60, 70 years, the level of activism that the Muslims will have in them will be minimal, in the sense that the Muslims who can tolerate it will no longer be Muslims in the sense that we know it, and the Muslims that can't will leave. And that's exactly what happens. So it's no different in academia in that sense. So what Muslims can do in academia is they can try to fight the struggle, continue to fight the struggle, recognize the machinery, and do what they can within the machinery. But I still think, like many other Muslims have said, we need to create an alternative Muslim space. Your life is not academia. Academia, your life is to please Allah Ta'ala. Your life in this dunya is very short. I'm starting to realize that more and more now, you know. I'm speaking to my mother when pandemic hit. I know a lot of people in the UK personally who passed away, and the fragility of life and the fragility of my parents' life is very real for me. And you realize then that, look, the work you do in this dunya, alhamdulillah, is important. This dunya, though, is still a test for you in that sense, in the sense that you're working in this dunya to please Allah Ta'ala. So this is your canvas that you're building on so that you can make it to the akhirah. So, but the interesting thing about dunya is people get obsessed with it. They become consumed by it. And I haven't seen anyone more consumed than academics at times. I have colleagues who are academics who are constantly talking about their work, academia, this person at uni. Yes, it's important. We work in academia and we're going to fight the fight and we're going to keep going. But it's not the be all, the end all. Remember that this is why I say about being brave, no matter what sphere or industry or thing we go into, we're here to please Allah. Let's never forget that. And so when we understand that, then no matter what we're producing for the sake of Allah, to please Allah. And when we're writing, then the long-term objective is that. And so then it requires us to be brave, and it requires us to be robust, and it requires us to be creative, and it requires us to be competent. And one thing we don't need is Muslims fighting amongst themselves, which I'm getting exhausted with. Like, we don't have time for this right now. So, you know, this is the thing. I'm going to give you just two little things. When I was young, my Hoja explained to me, Yakoob, you only have space of loving two types of entities. One is Allah Ta'ala, and two is to love someone for the sake of Allah. The loving Allah Ta'ala part is simple for us Muslims here. Loving people for the sake of Allah Ta'ala is your family, is your kin, your community, your society, and the ummah. And when you love people for the sake of Allah, you're going to realize that sometimes you're going to be treated in a way that doesn't make you happy, but you still do it for the sake of Allah, because you love people for the sake of Allah. And that's not easy, because sometimes you'll get battered by your own ummah. And that's okay. You keep going. And so when you're struggling in academia, when you're struggling intellectually, when you're struggling alone at home at night, when you're emotionally down, mentally going through something, physically going through something, and so forth, just remember that Allah is there for you and why you're doing this, and keep going. And that's why as a community it's important. Razan is fortunate that in the university she's in, she can talk to her professors this way. Even in Turkey, sometimes it's not that easy. But that's the Muslim space. The Muslim space should be one of support, one of intellectual cross-examination, of the Hajjahs being humble enough to listen to their students, the students being humble enough to give the Hajjahs a chance and not just judge them and second guess them. And we keep going. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but because there's no easy answer to this, to be honest with you. But I think we just got to keep trying. And if we are not happy with the people that we feel represent us, then we need to be better representatives of the next generation. Then we need to be better than the people that have let us down. Then we have to, my friend was saying to me the other day that, where are the Umar bin Khattabs and so forth? Okay, then become one in that sense. Okay, and that's not easy. And if you ask Allah Ta'ala for sabr, be careful, because Allah doesn't give you sabr like a dish on a plate. He's going to put you through situations where you learn sabr, because that's how Allah operates, and that's hard. And then once you become wise, you will be wisdom is usually a person who's been through some extreme life experiences. That's what gives wisdom. It's not in the books. That's just knowledge. But we're people of hikmah, so we have to experience.
I think also one of the pitfalls of Muslims, particularly Muslim minorities in the West, is that because we are being, because we essentially have to stand on several battlefronts, we forget that we're not actually homogenous ourselves, and it makes it much more difficult for us to actually accept criticism from our own communities. Because we expect people to have our back, and oftentimes they do have our backs, but this is the nature of the world. Everyone has a different interpretation. Everyone has a different standpoint. Our entire Islamic tradition and culture is different ulama and different perspectives and different interpretations. And I think that's something that we are all conscious of, but we often do forget because we have bigger battles in front of us.
Yeah, and as I think like there's so many fires that we have to put out sometimes. It's not easy. So no, I agree.
We have Malik. Malik, do you want to speak, or should I read your question out? Malik is excellent at articulating. But if he's not going to unmute, I shall read his question.
I'm sorry, Razan. If you can read it, that would be great. I'm unable to. I'm in a bit of a mess here. Please forgive me.
Okay, no problem, Malik. So Malik has asked, he says, I think Dr. Rajab Shanturk's multiplexity project and Ibn Khaldun University is interesting and worth looking into, but maybe facing challenges by official system of education in Turkey. What do you think of such newer examples like Ibn Khaldun, CMC, Zaytuna, etc.? And then he says, just use dialectics, academics love dialectics.
I mean, I think they're interesting, but they are at their infancy, so we won't know. But I don't think they should be the only models. I think I think we need to be careful of, at this moment in time of our infancy, where we're trying to create new models, to assume that that is the best model, because it needs time to know whether the model is working or not. And I think that there is no shame in still trying to create alternative models and alternative spaces and alternative ways of learning. And that's part of our tradition. There was, I'll give you an example of the Ottoman period. Mustafa Sabri Effendi is an alim who went through the traditional ilmiya system in the Ottoman domains, graduates from Tokat, goes to Istanbul and becomes Sheikh al-Islam. Rashid Ridda goes to a madrasa in Tripoli, ends up in Damascus, goes to Al-Azhar. Sayyid Nursi has a traditional one-on-one education with ulama in Mesopotamia, and then makes his way to Istanbul. There are different models, different forms of learning. All are ulama from the Islamic tradition, and all of them are respected in our culture of Islam in that sense. So the point I'm making is that I'm not one to promote one model over another, because a model is only as good as its resources, the people, the time it's in. Every model is going to have a time frame in which it's not going to work. What's important for me is that Muslims still have the desire to recognize, not to remain static, to keep trying something new in that sense. I am a strong believer, and maybe I'm one of the few, the person is the institution, okay? In the sense that the models in the university are less important to me than the idea itself. And many people in Islam were institutions. And there's a lot we can still learn from the pedagogy of mixing with people of knowledge. And we don't need certificates for that. We're trying to create a better society of people who are pious. What certificate will you give to somebody who's pious? What certificate do they need for that? Or altruism? What sort of certificate will you give to someone for teaching them generosity? What certificate will you give to someone to loving his wife and being good to her? There's no certificate here, but this is demanded from our faith. How would you teach that in the university? You can't teach that in the university. So in that sense, it's still limited, which means that we still need multiple modes of learning. We need to learn from our parents. We need to learn from our society. We need to still have what I call independent spaces of learning. You guys have created this platform. These sort of things are necessary. So the university circuit can only give you a particular thing. If it's dynamic, fair play to it. Fair play that it's dynamic. But the learning doesn't stop just because the classroom stops. The learning of being a good human being doesn't stop. And you don't only learn it from the classroom. I learned these from human beings. I learned, you would be surprised, I learned Islam from people who gave me a hug, who put their hand on my shoulder, who saw me cry, who told me off when I was doing things. And that put me in good stead for being an academic. I still remember I was at a conference where a Jewish academic said, the good thing about being a historian is that we have the liberty of getting away with making mistakes because the people we are writing about have passed away. And I challenged that straight away. I said, no, you can't. As a Muslim, because they are dead, there's more of an emphasis on me to make sure that I write good by them. What will I say to Allah on the day of judgment when that person said, this person said such and such about me? What would I say? So it's more important for me to scrutinize my own ideas when I'm writing about people because they can't defend themselves anymore. And so that culture was not taught to me in academia. That culture was taught to me by, an amja that used to pray in the mosque 5 times a day and used to pull me to a side and say, hey, what are you doing? So what I'm saying is that we should be smart enough to attain knowledge from everywhere. We should be intuitive enough to learn. I give an example. I was reading something by Muhammad Talal Asad, and he was saying that he got his spirituality not from his father, Muhammad Asad, but from his mother. And that's interesting because I'm the same. A lot of my Islam was what I saw in my mother doing in the house, which shaped my character. It was necessary. I can't put a certificate on that. I can't put, a label on that. So what I'm asking from you guys is to not burden yourselves or burden the idea that the university circuit or the academic circuit or Zaytuna or CMC or Ibn Khaldun are going to be the answer to your problems. It's just one form of knowledge you're learning. We want them to be dynamic. Yes, we want them to be able to compete with Oxford and Cambridge, fine. But that's not the only thing. And I want you to start searching for knowledge anywhere and everywhere you can find it. And the best way of taking knowledge is from taking it from people. We take knowledge from people who represent that, in the sense that Rasul Sallam was the walking Quran. He was the embodiment of Islam. We take that from people, and we should then demand to see that in our society. We should demand to see people like that in our community, in that sense, and we should try to be those people. So I've said this to you guys on many occasions, but I keep saying it over and over just to reiterate it, which is that I demand 4 things from your students. The first thing is sincerity, absolute sincerity. As a Muslim student, you have to be sincere. Without sincerity, you have nothing. When you read Surah Ikhlas, it's interesting because it's one of the few surahs in the Quran where Ikhlas is not in the surah itself. So the sincerity is what? Your sincerity is to Allah Ta'ala. If you are God-fearing in that sense, I'm using it in English sense, right? You have taqwa, then you're sincere because you don't want to upset your maker. And it's not that you don't want to upset your maker because you're afraid. It's like, I don't want to upset my mother. I don't want her to be ashamed of me in that sense. So I try to be the best son that I can. So be sincere. The next thing is to have knowledge. You have to learn knowledge as much as you can, but knowledge without sincerity means nothing. I mean, if your knowledge is not sincere, if your knowledge is just information, what's the point of the knowledge in that sense? So the knowledge is based on your sincerity. What's the knowledge for? To carry the haqq. The haqq is what exactly? The haqq is your deen, yeah. You have to carry this, you know, and this is why we say, well, us, in that verse, we're talking about haqq. And if you're going to speak haqq, you have to be brave. You have to be brave. You're not going to get away with that in that sense. And this is what's expected from us. You're not going to get this from academia. I never learned this from the books. I learned this from people. I saw it embodied in them. I saw them carrying it. I was inspired by them. So the point I'm making here is that while I understand the point that's being made, and I think some of these institutions are interesting. I work in the Ilahiyat, for example. I think what they're trying to do in terms of transition is interesting. Nonetheless, we need to cultivate a particular idea within our society. There has to be some sort of revolutionary thinking in our society that doesn't restrict it only to the institutions, but is dominant in every aspect of life. In the Ottoman period, there were 3 modes of learning: the ilmiya, the military, and the esnaf. These 3 different cultures. And the esnaf culture was what? Traders, people cooked food and so forth, but they still did it within the framework of Islam. So every, you know, whether it was the esnaf who was being upright with his customers, being honest with his customers, being fair to the traders, being a good Muslim, whether it was in the military where they were learning particular forms of education, or the ilmiya sector, what we saw is that Islam was manifested in every aspect of their education, which means that Islam can not only be manifested in the institutional structures, it has to be manifested in life, in the societies we're in. We have to demand it from our societies. I'm not convinced that our universities are going to bring Islam back. I think our universities are a reflection of the culture that we live in. And it's very easy for a university model to lose its way and collapse overnight. It's very easy to do that. But if it's manifested in society, then it's stronger. I went off on Monday anyway.
No, that was an excellent response. I've definitely very inspired by it. And I think just to add to it, in the Quran there's an ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. And over here, like the implication is that those who have knowledge understand the sincerity, because they also understand the gravity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think also this extends way beyond academia. I mean, as you were saying, Dr. Yakoob, that you learn like sincerity, and you learn like the holistic sort of skills, not just skills, like I mean, our adab from the Amja. I feel like personally, so I'm not necessarily an academic, I work very much in Syria, and Syria is a very dirty space to work in, because you're constantly battling so many different narratives, you're constantly having to work with people and against people, and advocacy, it's very, very difficult. But the one thing that's kept me grounded is my father. Mm-hmm. Every time I go back, my father, he's like my ground, like he's my rock. He always gives me the adab. He teaches me how to speak to people when I really want to, like, you know, when I'm infuriated and I just want to lash out at people. He's the one who kind of like holds me steady, because ultimately, yani, as much knowledge as we have and as much experience as we have, if we don't pair that up with our actual Islamic ethics and our actual Islamic moralities and adab, then we're not really doing much in this life, are we?
Yeah, I agree. And may Allah preserve your father. You know? Yeah, I agree.
Arsida, would you like to read out your question?
Yeah, sure. Assalamu alaikum. So I just wanted to ask, actually, I'm really curious about, so we see many people that are already moving to Turkey, especially many academicians. You as one of them, how do you see the difference between the Western academia and the Turkish one? Does it give you the space to keep at the same time your religious background? And also, I believe that in the future, we will see a kind of reshaping of the religious social discourse, moving into a more multicultural one. What are your thoughts regarding this?
Okay, let me bring out my crystal ball for a second. It's a good question. It's difficult. Look, I'm fortunate. I work in the Ilahiyat, okay? I'm the only Yabanji in the Ilahiyat, by the way. So even the Turks are surprised that I've survived this long, because usually people don't survive this long. The Turkish bureaucracy is a monster. But fundamentally, I told you before, I love Allah. So that's why I'm here. And I love my students for the sake of Allah. Students can students can sometimes not realize this, but you know, they complain about us Hodges, but we also could get frustrated by students. When we tell them to read stuff, they don't internalize it, they don't do the homework, they don't come to class. We have Zoom sessions, all the cameras are off. And even we need motivation in that sense. Alhamdulillah, though, I would say that in Turkey, we're in a moment right now where I think they're willing to, they can't give us the same financial provisions as in the West. So Muslims have to be aware of that one of the reasons why Muslims in the West are still staying in the West, because they believe that they have a better form of education. It means sending their kids to school, better health service, a better currency. And as a result of that, and they have a particular space for intellectual knowledge. So they don't want to make the jump of coming here. What I saw in regards to Turkey was an opportunity. And I think there is an opportunity here. Am I going to make the same money? No. Is the educational system the same as England? No. Is the health service the same as England? No. But that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that, alhamdulillah, I have a roof, I eat well, I sleep well, and I can teach Islam. So in that sense, you have to first weigh up your options in terms of what it is that you want in life. And for many academics who have worked very hard, so I'll give an example. The wage that I earn at the university here, my sister is a part-time administrator and makes more money than me. My mom's going crazy. She's like, well, you did a PhD for what then? Okay, but the reason why I'm here is because, as I mentioned to Razan earlier, I'm not simply trying to take. I'm convinced that if we want the Muslims in particular to do well in general, then we have to invest in Muslims. And it cannot be for the sake of material wealth. That has to be secondary or material gain. And so when you invest in Muslims, the hope is that you're going to see a progression where the Ummah will then take the reins of whatever's happening and create a better world for themselves, right? Now, when people keep asking me the situation of Palestine, like for the last 80 years, complaining to the West has given us nothing. What it needs is the Muslim to have their own agency. That's the reality, but that's not going to come overnight. You have to convince them of that. You have to make them believe that, and you have to intellectualize them in a way where they can be representatives of the masses, where they can do something and take them forward, right? So they have to provide an alternative worldview. That takes time. That requires struggle. Now, I could have done that in the UK, granted. But my belief was that it makes more sense to try to do it in a Muslim country, especially like the second part of your question, like Istanbul, where Istanbul is now becoming a unique melting pot. Now, when I talk about the future, I believe personally that the Turks at the moment do not recognize that the Syrian migration is going to be beneficial for them in the long term. Because I'm a son of a migrant. We know what migration does. Like migration has benefited the United Kingdom, irrespective of what they tell you. If they don't have migrants, they don't have a health service. 90% of those doctors are migrants. Most of them are Muslims in that sense. So in that sense, even here, I believe no matter what countries Muslims are coming from, for whatever reason, they have something to offer Turkey, but I don't think Turkey will see it until another 10 years. Because everyone wants to see it now, it's difficult. And even we may not see it because we're struggling.
I was about to ask that, like also after the Syrian war, there were many academicians that came to Turkey, but
yeah.
They were not used at all. Like, so most of them went to the Western countries, and I think
that's a mistake.
We are losing a lot actually in the terms of education, because we could really create a very good system based on these people coming from.
I agree. You know, somebody was asking me the other day, they said, why are you still in Turkey? And I said, look, as a Muslim, you don't run away when things get difficult. That's when you stick around. That's when you stick around. So when things get tough here, the expectation is that's when I stay here. That's when I try to give back. Otherwise, it would be very selfish of me to just get on I've got a British passport, I can go anywhere I want. What's the point? So I remember when I was speaking to my boss at work and I was frustrated and I said, I'm done with Turkey. And my boss goes, well, you're going to go back to London? I said, no, I'll go to Pakistan. So I was still thinking of another Muslim country. I wasn't thinking of going back to the West. I was thinking, okay, like I need to give my agency to Muslims. in that sense. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point? I said this in the talk I had yesterday. I support Liverpool. That's my team. That's the team I support. If they win the league, alhamdulillah. If they get relegated, that's still my team. That's the team I'm always going to support. The Ummah is my team. That's my team. That's the side I'm on. Like, if people want to leave Islam, ma salama, go. We don't need you. Like, what do you want me to do? I can't save everybody. Nor is that my job. In the sense that, I said this before, Iqbal had said that because he was talking about the time of science, and saying people are feeling ashamed of Islam, and so they're saying there's a deficiency in Islam, and so they leave in Islam. If only they understood the deficiency is not in Islam, but it's in you. It's you who has a deficiency, because you never understood what you were carrying in the first place. And so my belief is that Muslims need to invest in their learning of Islam. It's hard, because the amount of time you put into academia, there's very little time for you to put into Islam. Where's the time for the Islam? So then you have to go home and try to find it in the books. Whereas Islam requires the equal amount of time invested in that sense. So for me, I think Turkey is it's at an interesting crossroad at the moment. And I think in this difficult moment, we need to stick around. And I think all of us who are here, we may feel like at the moment that we're not being appreciated in the way that we should be appreciated. Yeah. But the results of that will be 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Okay, when my parents went to England, you know, I mean, they got a lot of racism. They stuck it through. And then they had kids who went to university and got a PhD. So, you know, okay, they're disappointed that I left the UK, because their belief was, my parents, was that we didn't come to the UK so that you go backwards. But when my parents came here, they got it. They got it straight away. Like, alhamdulillah, you know, my son is happy. He's in a Muslim country. Fine. You know, it's not easy. He struggles from time to time, but I'm happier that he's happier here. And we have different challenges here, because you know what? I'm now starting to appreciate the challenges of my parents. I get it. You know, they went to a foreign country, couldn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture. People were complaining, people were being racist, blah, blah, blah. I get it. And so, you know what? When I go home now and my mom goes, you know what? I go, yeah, I know, Mom. You're right. And that's how it is, Yani, that's how it is. So
it also feels like before it was like for most of the Muslims, the challenge was to go to the Western countries. And that was also kind of jihad for them, because you would go and like, you will explain your religion to that we're non-Muslims. But it feels like now it's totally the opposite. Like we're all trying to go back to our countries or to our Muslim countries and try to put like a more established understanding of Islam and like being more organized in terms of that.
You know, my personal belief, and this is a radical thought, but so in the past, when the ulama used to write works on Islam, the Muslim world was the center. And so when they were producing knowledge, it was reflective of the world they lived in. Now, a lot of Muslim works are produced in the West. Now, the thing is the West is a power base, but it reflects a different center. The center is not Islam. So even when we're producing works within that framework. What we need to do is pull it back into the Muslim world, rather than draining the Muslim world out and giving all our resources to the West. I mean, look, I give an example. The United States of America does not create the best students. What the United States of America does is it takes the best students. That's where the empire is clever. The empire is clever because it doesn't discriminate. It just takes talent and it will pay for it. And so this is why people keep going to the West. And we keep going to the West. And then we go to the West and then we're miserable. But we're making more money. And so we convince ourselves that we're happy. And then when we come to Turkey, it's weird because we're content with being subjugated by the white man. But Allah forbid we are subjugated by another Muslim. Shame on you, I'm educated. You're not going to subjugate me. But that guy can. No, look, we don't need to be subjugated by anyone. When we come to the Muslim country, we will fight for our rights here just as much as we will fight for our rights there. But I think we have a responsibility to try to improve the Muslim communities, even if they don't appreciate it, even if they can't see it. That's part of the struggle. I mean, that's what we do. So that's why we're still here. So we keep going. The Muslim world is big, Yani. It has a lot of human resources.
Ultimately, this pours back into our tradition. Our tradition is an ongoing thing, and I think sometimes we assume that it's something that's in the past, but no, the Islamic tradition is alive, it's ongoing.
Yeah.
So we need to pull back in. Dr. Yakoob, we have 15 minutes left and we have 3 questions. Okay. So I'm gonna read out Ahmed. Abdullah, if you don't mind, we're gonna keep your question to the end because it's excellent. It's an excellent way to wrap up. I'm gonna read out Ahmed's question, and then we have a question from Umama. And then we'll finish with Abdullah's question. Ahmed's question is, it's a bit long, so I'm just going to read it out. He says, those who are currently, and it's linked to Alcida's question. Those who currently study inside Turkey, we think that going to Western countries is a good opportunity for master's or a PhD degree. But do you think that we can obtain this in Turkey? What do you think the academy in Turkey now, especially for social sciences, what do you think the academic degree is in Turkey now, especially for social sciences and history and politics? Those who currently study inside Turkey, I think he's repeated the question twice. Yes, okay. So Ahmed's question is, those who are currently inside Turkey are looking to go out. Do you think they can still obtain what they want inside Turkey? And then he's also asking, I guess, about the academic level when it comes to studying social sciences, history and politics. Is it necessary to go out in order to get the best education, or can you get it here?
It's a difficult one, Razan, to be honest. Look, things are not perfect here. We have to be honest. So I'm not going to pretend and tell my students that, or people who want to study here, that they're not facing particular challenges, especially in terms of the workforce, employment. Once you graduate, what's going to happen? These are very uncertain times. I also don't have a problem with Muslims going to the West to study in the West. But what I'm saying is, don't intellectually leave yourself there. Keep traveling to Muslim countries, still coming backwards and forwards to Muslim countries, and still invest in Muslim countries. I think in Turkey, the academia is good in the sense that I've had students who have made their way to Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and so forth, which is an indication then that they are getting an educational product here, which is good enough for them to make it to those universities, which is an indication then that the educational product here is not that bad. I think the educational system here in some universities is also improving, and I think that they will improve. And I think that Turkey is on the upward curve. The problem with Turkey, I guess, is that quantity and quality, there's an issue. There are very few quality universities over quantity universities. I mean, in the sense that there are many universities in Turkey, but not all of them are good in that sense. So that's part of the problem. Istanbul has the better universities, and then the options are few and far between. But I think whenever I give anyone advice, I always tell them to come and see me personally. The reason being is so that I can give the right advice for that person or what's right for them. We had a student here in Turkey who wanted to study in SOAS, had an option to study in SOAS, but she would have to leave her grandmother behind. She was the sole carer for her grandmother. She loved her grandmother to bits. No one else to look after her. As a result of that, I gave her the advice that might be for her emotional well-being and her family well-being, it might be better to stay here, do a PhD in this country. She did that and she got a job and it worked out for her. For another student in the subject that they wanted to do, I encouraged them to go to England because I thought that the subject area they wanted to study and the way that their lifestyle is, that it would be better for them to go to England. If they wanted to stay in England, that was fine. I recommended that they come back, but not everybody does come back. That's part of the problem with the brain drain. But what I say is if you are over there, there's still no reason why you still can't intellectually and emotionally invest over here. We have many avenues where you can do that. For example, I live in Turkey, but continuously I'm giving talks to students in England. I teach madrasa students in England over Zoom. So it's not like I've abandoned them in that sense. I've still found a way of trying to help out. So it can still be done. Once again, we have to be creative. But I think I accept that the academic models in the West are still better. There's no doubting that. So what I say is if you want to go there, then go there. But do come back if you can. Do come back. And if you're concerned that when you come back here that your quality of life won't be the same, that requires an evaluation because that changes from day to day, from year to year. So one really doesn't know in that sense. But, you know, I was teaching this about the state of Israel, where I said, Theodore Hertz, he wrote in his book, the Jewish State, he said, the way that we can establish our Jewish state, he says we need people of intelligence, of enterprise, and who have materials to bring to this state to strengthen it. I make the same case then to Muslims, that that's what we need here, otherwise we're going to lose it. It's hard. It's hard. Every individual has their own choices to make, but I've decided to stay. I can only tell you what I've decided to do. I've decided to stay, and I'm trying to give you something back.
I think also, I don't know how to phrase this question, but just based on what you said about do come back. Of course, you're speaking to people who aren't necessarily living in the UK or in the West to start off with, because there are also communities there. And the reason why many of us feel failed is because we are first generation or second generation, even third generation, but we are still building our communities. And many of us need to stay where we are in terms of in London, in Los Angeles, in Florida, wherever we are, in Germany, because it's not just us. Now we have waves of refugees, waves of migrants. So I feel like that's also, it's also important for us to bear in mind, not everyone necessarily has to come back to the East.
And that's why I said it matters on an individual scale. Each individual, I give different advice to them depending on what their circumstances are.
Absolutely. We'll take the question from Umama before we conclude with Abdullah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much, Dr. Yakoob. It's been a really insightful discussion. My question is a little bit different. It's more about how one can deliver knowledge. So I find that like often when we gain knowledge, especially in the academic world, we learn two things. One is like how little we actually know. And two, it's kind of like just in the same way that if someone is a hafiz or someone is given the opportunity to gain knowledge and other people aren't, I suppose the same way that Ibrahim alayhi salam was given knowledge and his dad wasn't, you have a responsibility to deliver that knowledge in a way that people are able to understand and to listen to it in the way that the Prophet ﷺ used to do, without lashing out, without anger, and kind of delivering it so that each individual person is able to understand that, which I think we have to know, we have to learn how to do as people who are given the opportunity to be in the academic world. So my question is, how can you learn how to deliver this knowledge and how to be responsible with what you have in your hand? You know, how do we learn how to deliver it, and how do we learn how to use our platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so you know, quite Iqbal again, because Iqbal is funny. So he said the difference between the philosopher and Rasul Sallam, because was the philosopher only spoke knowledge with the people at the top, whereas when Rasul Sallam gave hadith, both the knowledgeable and the regular people understood what he was saying. And so in that sense, one of the things which academia does, which infuriates me to some degree, is that we write in a style where people can't understand what you're saying. It's not helpful. So what we can do is we can write academic books for academics, which are full of jargon, but then we can translate that alternatively to regular folk in another medium as well at the same time. Or what we can do is when we write academically, we write in a way that can be understood by everybody. Now that's the part of academia, but the other part of your question regarding responsibility, now this is interesting because the reason why the ulama in the past were important is because they were living with people. They were sharing experiences with people. So the imam at the mosque, for example, people would come to the imam and complain, say such and such is happening. Or a wife would come and say, my husband is doing such and such. To the qadi, they would say, my son is like this, the neighbor's done that. So the judge had a sense of wisdom. And the reason why the judge would have wisdom or the imam would have wisdom and so forth, because they were entrenched in their communities. They understood the pain, the suffering, the complaints, the successes of their communities. When we are disconnected from people, when we are disconnected from our communities, when we are disconnected from the pain and suffering from those that are going through it, then we are unable to relay the message to them in a way which is translatable. That's part of the problem. So there is a disconnect. And my concern has been that social media has increased that disconnect. There's a reason why Twitter is toxic, because you're disconnected from human beings in your capacity as a human being. You would never say those things to me on the street. No way. I guarantee. So some of the things that people say on Twitter, if they saw me in the street, they wouldn't dare say it. And it's that syndrome where you're driving a car, and you're stuck in your car and you can yell at people. But the minute the guy opens the door, you freak out. So the point I'm making is that human touch is missing. You know, and there's a saying by Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he said, Rasul used to laugh with us and cry with us. It's important. It was Weber who spoke about the charismatic leader. He said the charismatic leader is prophetic. It's interesting Weber says that because Ibn Khaldun also mentions it. He says that the charismatic leader understood the culture of Nubuwwah, which is the idea that he understood the mass. He understood because he lived with them. The tradition of Nubuwwah then, and I'm not saying Islam, but especially about being a prophet in many ways, is to be integrated in your communities. And if you're integrated, then you know exactly how to pass that information off to them. So my concern is that the more educated we're becoming, the more disconnected we are becoming from each other. So to answer your point, where we lack the sort of like emotional intelligence, and I've made this argument before when people get upset. I think a lot of Muslims, and one of the problems in the Muslim world right now is we lack emotional intelligence. It's not actually intelligence per se, but emotional intelligence. We can be very coarse with each other, very harsh. That could be from the colonial legacy, by the way. It could be from the violence of the colonial legacy that seeps in to the point that we internalize the subjugation to such a degree that we would tell our children, you can't achieve that because we're afraid, we're nervous. And so we internalize that. It's possible. There are multiple layers to why we do this. But what I think what we need to do is we need to be emotionally attached to each other. And so that knowledge, you can't learn that in university. You can't learn that on Twitter. The only way you learn that is from family and from each other. And so you have to be connected with each other. We have a lot of work in our culture where the ulama talk about be kind to someone. So I've mentioned this before, that in the Quran, when Allah Ta'ala says about, he says to the men to be kind to their wives, he doesn't say love them, he says be kind to them. And I always explain this point. The reason being is because you can love someone and still be mean, but kindness is a behavior. And Allah Ta'ala expects kindness as a behavior from you in that sense, right? So how do you teach kindness? You have to be kind and people have to see it. And then you replicate it because you're experiencing it. So we need more of this. So I feel like those people who are people of knowledge in our communities, information is insufficient if you're emotionally disconnected. Well, what's the point of the works that you write if you're not emotionally connected to the people you're giving it to? So in the past, if we read like Ghazali, not only was Ghazali writing, but he was connected. So that's what I think it should be expected from us. And so this is why when people ask me all the time, why you're not on social media? It's because I'm on the ground. You know, and I remember someone saying to me, oh, I thought you went to London. I said, why is that? You're not on Instagram anymore. Instagram is not the indication that I still live in Turkey, but people see me in Turkey. I have coffee with people in Turkey and so forth, right? So I think to answer your question, Umayman, is I think the ummatic paradigm, if we're going to use that word, is a paradigm in which Islam has a particular expectation in terms of our character. And that character can only be learned from each other. And as a teacher, I try, my students might disagree with me, but I try to embody that when I'm talking to them. I've tried to be as available to my students as possible. Whenever they've wanted me, I've always said to my students that if you have any doubts regarding Islam, come and see me, no matter what. I'm not going to judge you, but I need to speak to you. The last thing I want to do is dispel them and send them away, right? So we have to be emotionally connected. That's not easy. Not many of us have those skills, but that's what's required from us. So I think that's my personal opinion. I don't think you can teach information without emotion. The Quran is emotional. Let's take it from Allah Ta'ala himself. Allah Ta'ala, he touches your emotional strings. So we need to be more emotionally knowledgeable, I guess. We need to be sensitive. We need to be, we need to know how to speak to people when. Sometimes you have to speak to them harsh. Sometimes you need to know how to be soft and polite. And this is lacking. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you so much. Really, really, really helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Yakoob. I think also modernity in general has made us very the opposite of sensitive, to the extent how being sensitive in any capacity in life often brings forth negative connotations. We were all brought up in societies where being sensitive was used as more of an insult or as a slur, or you were told not to be too sensitive, when actually you have to be too sensitive. The Prophet himself, ﷺ, was very, very sensitive to those around him, to the extent that he could actually read between the lines. I think there's a story of Abu Hurairah, radiallahu anhu. At one point he didn't have food, and he went and he spoke to Umar ibn Khattab, and he spoke to him. Abu Hurairah had too much pride to tell him that I want food, so he said something, I can't remember what it was, and Ahmad didn't understand it, and he just went along his way. And he went to Abu Bakr, and he also spoke to him, and Abu Bakr didn't understand him, and he also went along his way. And Rasulullah heard all of this, so he went to Abu Hurairah and said, "Come with me," and he took him to the house of someone who had food, and he made him drink milk, and he made him eat, and the Prophet only ate after he saw that Abu Hurairah himself was satisfied. And I think it's very important for us in general to like embody all of this, as you said.
Yeah, I thought, you know what, it's funny you say that, because I've done this on many occasions. I remember going out with someone who I knew they wouldn't take money from me because there was a sense of pride. So we went out to eat.
Yeah.
We said, let's go out to eat. And I haven't eaten all day. Have you eaten? He went, no. I said, okay, let's eat then, because I'm hungry. And we went out to eat, and I fed them, and we ate, and that was fun. I remember one time I was fasting on a Monday, and we went to someone's house, and they offered me tea. So I drank the tea. And my friend was looking at me and going, what were you doing? I thought you're fasting. I said, yeah, but let them have the barakah. It's okay. You know, this is our deen, and understand it properly, you know. And, you know, it's that famous story of Abu Hurairah when Salman al-Farsi goes to his house. And Abu Hurairah wants to pray tahajjud all night. And Salman says, yeah, Abu Hurairah, what are you doing? You got a guest in your house, you're not going to sit with me? So then he sits with him until they both fall asleep. And Abu Hurairah feels guilty. And then when they wake up, he gives Salman al-Farsi breakfast, and he goes, Abu Hurairah, you're not going to eat? He goes, I'm fasting. He goes, oh, Abu Hurairah, you want to do this to a guest who's come? Come, son, sit, eat with me. So he broke his fast. Then Abu Hurairah complained to Rasul Sallam. He goes, you know, he wouldn't let me do that. And then Rasul Sallam, Salman is right. You know, Abu Hurairah, the deen is of moderation. So, you know, we learned that this, and this is what I'm saying, this aspect of our deen, this compassion, it's missing in people. We need it. It's okay, we can get angry, we can get frustrated, but we're a deen where we give people time to rehabilitate, we give people time for redemption, we give people to, Allah Ta'ala demands forgiveness from us, you know. It's one of the problems I have in Western society, because I was explaining to my current batch of students that when you read Salah, and you read 5 times a day, and if you put the rak'ahs together, and we recite Fatiha, and in Fatiha is Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Understand what that means, that Allah Ta'ala is the Rahman and He's the Rahim. It's important to recognize that, and we're saying it so often. And not only that, we also recite the Basmala, which has Rahman and Rahim in it, right? Now, the reason why this is important is because when Allah Ta'ala is not involved in your life, and you have nobody to turn to, and you have nobody to ask forgiveness for, and it leaves a sense of guilt in you to such a degree that your validation is taken from people that you can become suicidal. You can't be surprised that people become depressed and suicidal this way, because they have no outlet, because the only outlet they have is other people who are judging them all the time. So this mechanism, in that sense, is emancipating if it's understood that Allah will forgive you, even if people don't. It's fine, because it's Allah who decides what's right and wrong. And so because Allah Ta'ala is the most compassionate in that sense, and that's necessary. So I always, like, I have the 99 names of Allah, and I always try to go through them, because I always find it interesting. Like okay, like, you know, what does this mean? And it's amazing in that sense that we should understand that who Allah is in that sense, and then that you can place yourself in this dunya in the apt way. So yeah, we can't be so coarse all the time, you know. Rasul Sallam, listen to the way he speaks to his beloved, and it was very human.
So on that note, we will ask Abdullah's question. Abdullah's question is, when it comes to academia, most of us are having a big struggle with motivating ourselves on moving from the level of thinking and willingness to do something into doing. How do you motivate yourself, and what do you suggest to us in this regard? And if I can add to that, a few questions that we got in from on private, people are asking the same as Abdullah's question, but in the words, literally the wording is, how do you motivate yourself to wake up in the morning?
You know, so I would be lying if I said to you that don't talk about this. I'm gonna tell you, look. So I was speaking to my mom last week, and my mom goes, how are you doing? I said, Mom, it's been tough. And she goes, yeah, you're alone. I said, yeah, pandemic, alone, stuck in a foreign country. And mentally, I'm every day I'm waking up and we go again. Every day feels like Groundhog Day. And my mom's like, how are you doing this? And I say, you know what? The difficulty is not praying Salat al-Fajr. The difficulty is doing wudu. The difficulty is waking up and actually doing the up test itself. But I wake up and I do it. And when I do it, I feel good. And in many ways, motivation is tough. And Allah Ta'ala in the Quran motivates people in different ways. For example, during the Battle of Badr, Allah Ta'ala reminded the Muslims not to get arrogant. And during the Battle of Uhud, when the Muslims on the hill felt a sense of shame, Allah Ta'ala reminds them, it's okay, I've forgiven you, I know what's in your heart. So in that sense, there's different forms and different ways of motivating. There is, you know, a sense of self-motivation one needs, and there being attached to Islam is important. I give an example. I was talking to a friend only the other day that if you truly loved Allah, you would pray your namaz properly. Because you love Allah, you want to do that action for Him. So in that sense, we have to work, and this is hard, but we have to work on the way that regarding our relationship with our Lord, fundamentally, because that's where we will get the sort of like optimal sense of motivation. But that's only one aspect of motivation. The other part of motivation is you need people to motivate you. Of course you do. It's impossible to do this alone. This is why when you get married, you need your spouse to motivate you. Your children need parents to motivate them. You need friends who are going to motivate you to say, it's okay, you can do this. You need friends to tell you the truth. In that sense, you have to put yourself in environments where you have to be brave enough to have these relationships where you can tell your fellows without feeling being judged that I need help, I'm struggling, I'm going through depression, I'm going through stress, I can't wake up in the morning for Fajr. And you want Muslims not to judge you. You want them to say, okay, we can fix this. What's the point? And we have this story from Rasulullah when the woman had become pregnant from zina. What was he doing? He said, go away, go away. And then he asked people, is she drunk? He's trying to find excuses for her in that sense. And so we shouldn't be so judgmental, judging Muslims in that way. We should find a way of trying to say, okay, it happened. How can we make this better? How can we fix it? You've come to me. That means that there's trust. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all sinners. Fine, but we need to find a way of that. So the motivation first has to come in regards to your relationship with Allah. And you know what's interesting is I always find it interesting what people are motivated for. So for example, I always make fun of my male students when you want to get married, you're super uber motivated. You find a way of finding a wife. You will travel the world for it. But then when I try to motivate you to read this book, you won't do it. Because it's about priorities. It's about what we think is important for us in our lives in that sense, in that context. So we have to make that important. So self-motivation is tough for all of us. There's no golden rule. There's no, and it's up and down. Some days you feel exceptionally motivated. You're going to go to the gym every day. A year later, you can't be bothered. That's just the nature of human beings. That's your disposition. So the first thing I would say is to be close to Allah, improve your ibadat, and read Quran. I used to be told that when you want to speak to Allah, you pray salah. And when you want Allah to speak to you, you read the Quran. So that's the advice I will give you. Work every day to improve your relationship with your Lord. Love His messenger. Improve your relationship with understanding the message of His messenger in that sense. Try, he's Habibullah in that sense, okay? Allah Ta'ala loves him, so you must love him. And if you love him and understand what he was doing, you'll become a better human being for it. Surround yourself with good people. Surround yourself with people who are like-minded. Surround yourself with people who will not bring you down, but will elevate you. We are people that elevate each other, not bring each other down, including Muslims. If you got friends who are Muslims, are always negative, going to bring you down, so forth. You don't need those people in your life. You want Muslims in your life who are understanding, who are caring, and so forth. If you can't find those people, be those people. Be those people that do that for others. You have to be a people of servitude and do that. And then you can have regular mechanisms of finding ways of motivating. But motivation is a constant battle or struggle. It's the nature of insan. It's hard. And we all go through it. I love chocolate. What do I need to do? Like, I want to go to the gym, but every day I see chocolate, and that's my weakness. And I wish somebody could just hide it from me, in that sense. So that's the only advice I can give regarding motivation. I try to motivate my students as much as I can, to the best of my ability, to see the best in them. But you don't want to get used to the idea of of consuming even motivation. It's such a consumption culture now that we constantly want people to feed us with something for us to be motivated. There has to be a desire here, okay? In that sense, there has to be a desire to want to do that. So yeah, let's not be people of consumption, and let's be people of production in that sense. And so we have to improve our relationships across the board in that sense. Islam is your relationship with Allah, your relationship with yourself, your relationship with others. You have to, then understand what Islam is asking you from here. So these things have to be important to you. I'm not saying they're not, but sometimes we may think it's important, but we become lazy. And now with the pandemic, it becomes harder. Everyone is stuck inside. So I understand.
We have to be the source from within. Dr. Yakoob, it's been such a pleasure listening to you and having this conversation with you. It's been such a profound and insightful discussion for myself, and I'm sure for everyone else. Thank you so much for your time. You mentioned that you believe very much that the person is an institution. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from this. And I really hope that all of us here in the audience get to consciously witness the becoming of and the completion of you being an institution, and also to live long enough to actually see your legacy and hopefully tread in your footsteps ourselves.
Can I add to that, Razan? Sorry, just to interrupt you. I'm going to say something that I say to all my students. My students will say, don't be like me, be better than me. And I have no doubt in my mind, in that sense, that I want all of you to be better than me. Okay, in that sense. So as Muslims, we always strive for the next generation to be better than us. In that sense, I have no doubt in my mind, looking back at when I was your age, you're far more creative than me, you're far more motivated than me, you work a lot harder than me. In that sense, you can achieve this. You have to envisage it, you have to believe it. It doesn't happen without that sense of belief and trust. Have trust in Allah Ta'ala, have trust in His deen, don't just believe it. You can do this. And for all the kind words you said to me, and I mean back to you, because I think all of you in that sense have something really interesting to offer. And I pray to Allah Ta'ala that He elevates you so that all of you can achieve far more than what we achieved in my generation.
Ameen, Hajam, Ameen. So on that note, thank you so much. And thank you so much to our audience. But please don't leave yet. I'm going to be passing on to Sumbul to wrap up.
Okay.
Brothers and sisters and friends, sadly, we have come to the end of the session. First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Yakoob, for this insightful discussion. It was amazing for us. And thank you, Razan, for moderating the session tonight. And also thanks to all the Istanbul Youth Academy team for organizing and contributing to everything tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And please do not forget to follow us on Instagram. Stay tuned. See you in upcoming sessions. Take care of yourselves. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.